Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a chilling journey back in time to unveil the truth about the Gestapo, Germany's secret state police. This wasn't merely a law enforcement agency, it was a powerful and brutal entity that instilled terror not only in those who defied Nazi Germany, but also in the ranks of the Nazis themselves. The Gestapo was, in essence, Adolf Hitler's extended arm. As Chancellor of Germany and the Supreme Führer, he wielded it as the ultimate tool to purge all political opponents, whether they were outside the party or within its very core. And who headed the Gestapo? Individuals fanatically loyal to Hitler, driven by fierce political ambition, cunning, and cold-blooded ruthlessness. This organization thrived on brutality, operated by spreading fear, and most strikingly, it stood above the law. The story begins in 1933, immediately after Hitler came to power. Hermann Göring, a high-ranking Nazi leader who would later become commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Air Force, was granted control over Prussia's largest police force, serving as Prussian Minister of the Interior. Göring quickly separated the political and intelligence departments from traditional policing, replacing them with loyalists. On April 26, 1933, he officially merged these units to form the Gestapo. The first chief of the Gestapo was Rudolf Diels, a trusted protege of Göring. It was Diels who was the chief interrogator of Marinus van der Lubbe in the Reichstag fire on the night of February 27, 1933. This was no accident. Diels later testified that Göring knew about the fire beforehand and ordered him to prepare arrest lists immediately. Exploiting this incident, Hitler pressured President Hindenburg to sign the Decree for the Protection of People and State, suspending fundamental personal freedoms and granting Hitler nearly absolute power to suppress all opposition. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly, all vanished. Gradually, the Gestapo's power shifted. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and head of the Bavarian police, with the drive of his right-hand man, Reinhard Heydrich, systematically gained control of police forces across Germany. By April 1934, Heydrich officially became head of the Gestapo, simultaneously serving as head of the SD, Security Service. The rise of the SS and Gestapo led to a bloody purge within the Nazi Party in 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives. Himmler and Göring allied against Ernst Röhm, chief of staff of the SA, the Nazi Party's large paramilitary force. The Gestapo orchestrated and supplied fabricated intelligence about an impending SA coup to Hitler. The result? Over 100 of Hitler's political opponents were murdered, allowing Himmler and Heydrich to completely eliminate the SA's influence. There was even a horrifying case of mistaken identity, like that of Dr. Willy Schmid, an innocent music critic, who was mistakenly arrested and murdered by the SS, then brutally covered up. By 1936, Hitler formally decreed the integration of all police forces into the SS, placing them entirely under Himmler's control. At this point, Himmler was the Reich leader of the SS and chief of German police. Heinrich Müller became head of Gestapo operations, and later, the Gestapo officially became Department 4 of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, a super-agency headed by Heydrich. The Gestapo's reach extended further than ever before. Müller reported directly to Heydrich, Heydrich directly to Himmler, and Himmler answered only to Hitler. The Gestapo's primary role was security intelligence, but it also oversaw the establishment and operation of concentration camps. They engaged in surveillance, detention, and torture. Notably, the Gestapo was responsible for prominent figures like the commander-in-chief of the army or former chancellors and ministers, and when ordered by Hitler or Himmler, they were prepared to execute these individuals. The Gestapo held unlimited power. A fundamental law in 1936 allowed them to operate without judicial review. They could detain anyone without trial, euphemistically termed protective custody. With the Night and Fog Decree from 1941, Political prisoners across occupied Europe simply vanished when arrested by the Gestapo. A prime example of the Gestapo operating above the law is the case of Pastor Heinrich Müller. Arrested and later acquitted by a court, he was immediately rearrested by the Gestapo upon leaving the courthouse and held indefinitely in protective custody. Or the case of General Werner von Fritsch, then Commander-in-Chief of the Army, who was framed by the Gestapo with false accusations of homosexuality under Himmler's direction to remove him from his position. Though later exonerated, he was never reinstated. The Gestapo showed no tolerance for any dissent, however minor. In early 1943, at the University of Munich, a student group, notably Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with Professor Kurt Huber, distributed anti-Nazi leaflets. Despite being a small movement, the Gestapo's response was brutally swift. The Scholl siblings were arrested, tortured, and brought before the notorious People's Court, presided over by the bloodthirsty Roland Freisler. Sophie bravely confronted him. "You know as well as we do that the war is lost. Why are you too cowardly to admit it?" Both siblings and Professor Huber were executed. Even high-ranking military figures weren't immune. After Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, the Gestapo arrested 7,000 people and executed nearly 5,000, including many key generals and intellectuals. Himmler's ambitions also extended to the Abwehr and military intelligence of the German army. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, director of the Abwehr, had attempted to protect his subordinates involved in plots against Hitler, such as Hans von Dohnanyi and Colonel Hans Oster, Canaris's chief assistant. But ultimately, the Gestapo arrested them. This exposed the conspirators' network, leading to Himmler seizing military intelligence functions. Canaris and Oster were executed by the SS in April 1945, just a month before Germany's surrender. When Nazi Germany was finally defeated, many high-ranking Gestapo officials were arrested and tried. The organization itself was condemned as a primary criminal organization. Rudolf Diels, the former Gestapo chief in its early phase, he escaped the initial purges and was not prosecuted after the war, serving as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. Hermann Göring, former Prussian Minister of the Interior. He was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, but committed suicide by poisoning himself before execution. Reinhard Heydrich, former head of the Gestapo and RSHA. He was assassinated by Czech resistance in 1942. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief responsible for many of its most brutal operations, including the extermination of Jews and the pursuit of anti-Hitler plotters. He mysteriously disappeared at the end of the war, April 30, 1945, and was never brought to justice. Adolf Eichmann, former head of the Gestapo's Office for Jewish Affairs, coordinating the mass deportation of European Jews to extermination camps. He escaped to Argentina but was captured by Israel's Mossad in 1960, tried and executed in Israel. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as head of the RSHA. He was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials. The history of the Gestapo is a stark reminder of how absolute power can transform a state agency into an instrument of ultimate terror and oppression. It shows us what can happen when fear is sown, and when a totalitarian regime stands above all law, leaving an indelible scar on human history.